books. But then one night I was vacationing on a sailboat in the Virgin Islands, and I was anchored off St. John in the Virgin Islands, and I climbed this mountain there, and up on top of the mountain is an old sugarcane plantation in ruins, Bougainville. It's very beautiful. The sun was setting. It was wonderful, and I'm sitting there kind of feeling the ecstasy of the place, and suddenly I'm struck by the fact that this sugarcane plantation had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I got to thinking about how the whole hemisphere has been built on the bones of thousands, millions of slaves. It made me very sad and very angry. And then as I sat there, I realized that I too was a slaver. Slightly different kind of slavery, but nonetheless what I was doing in the world was creating another form of slavery so that we could live these lives here. And at that point, I made the decision never to do it again. And after that vacation, I went back and quit as an economic hitman. But I didn't do anything about it for a long time. I started to write a book about it, which became Confessions. A number of times I was threatened. I went out and talked to other economic hitmen to get their stories, and the word got around, and threats came to me, and also bribes. I accepted some pretty good-sized bribes not to write the book. I gave most of the money to nonprofits I formed to help some of the indigenous people we'd screwed fight the oil companies, as they're doing with great success right now in the Amazon. Well, not enough success, but they're beginning to have success. So to assuage my guilt a bit, but I didn't write the book. And then on 9/11, I was in the Amazon on 9/11, and afterwards I came up to ground zero. And as I stood there looking down into that terrible smoldering pit, I knew I had to write about this, because I understood that most Americans had no comprehension of why there's so much anger and frustration and hatred around the world, which is in no way to condone the mass murder that occurred there or excuse the people who perpetrated it. But it is to say that I understood that I had an obligation. I was responsible for what happened there. In a way, we're all responsible for what happened there, and that we need to understand the role that we are playing in the world today, this 5% that consumes 25% of the resources. And so I decided to write the book. And during this period, I'm struggling with this idea of what is a good unifying principle. And it goes in process in the book of how we arrived at this, but I finally came to the conclusion that I think a good unifying principle is for each of us to commit ourselves to creating a stable, sustainable, and peaceful world for all people everywhere. I don't think we can argue with that. I don't think anybody in the world would probably argue against wanting to see that happen. Part of the reason for this is this true understanding that no child can grow up in the United States. My grandson cannot expect to inherit such a world unless every child being born in Nigeria and Indonesia and Bolivia expects that too. We live on a very small planet today. When I was an economic hitman, one time I spent 3 days trying to make a phone call from Jakarta, Indonesia to Boston, Massachusetts. Today you can make a phone call from a cell phone from just about any place on the planet, and you can send a whole book over the internet instantaneously. Things have really changed in the last few decades. We live on a very small planet. Homeland security can only occur to us when we realize that this whole planet is the homeland, and everybody on it must have that security. So I think this unifying principle of committing to a stable, sustainable, and peaceful world for everyone everywhere, I think by defining it as sustainable and stable, we also take into account all the plants and animals and the environment too. So this brings us to the third question. Do we have reason to be optimistic? Do we believe that we really can change the situation? And I am extremely optimistic that we can. I know we can change it and that we must. We know for one thing that empires always collapse, and this one will too. So we need to change it. We know that when empires collapse, a void is created, and then a new empire sets up. And we don't want to see that happen again. What we need to do at this point is something that's never been done in history before, to take this empire and turn it around and use it as a vehicle for realizing the dream that's so beautifully expressed in our most sacred documents like the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, everywhere. And why should we be optimistic? Well, first I think we have to look at who's in charge of this empire. Where's the emperor? We really don't have the emperor that people normally think. You know, our president serves for a limited term. That's not an emperor. And this empire has been increasing, has been building upon itself, regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House and in Congress. Certain things are different, but not that march toward empire. That's consistent. So who's the emperor? Well, we do have an emperor, and it's really a group of people acting as emperor. It's what I call the corporatocracy, which is a group of primarily men, a few women, who run our biggest corporations. It's not a conspiracy. This is not a conspiracy theory. These people don't have to conspire. They know what serves their best self-interest best. They don't have to go sitting in dark rooms or making secret telephone calls to each other. They're not conspiring to do this. It's part of the system. But they very much run this country all the time, regardless of who the president is. And they run the world, in fact. And often you can't tell the difference between who's the CEO of a big corporation and who's Secretary of State, because they just jump back and forth between the two, or vice president or even president. And they finance all of our politicians. So we know that we've been told that in the next election, the two final candidates, Republican and Democrat, are each going to have to raise $500 million. Well, how much are you going to contribute? We're not going to contribute very much. That money is going to come primarily from the corporations, not directly, but through their owners and through their managers. In the old